My name is Janet Van Sloan. I'm the restoration specialist for the city of Minnetonka. There aren't very many cities that have a restoration specialist. And we're in the Natural Resources Division, which is growing, and there are very few cities that have a Natural Resources Division, so we are really, really fortunate here. So I'm going to tell you that my background is in urban and community forestry, and I totally changed careers because I was stuck in a computer room, a really dark computer room, and I wanted to get outside, and I became a plant geek when I went to school studying forestry, and I have a degree in urban and community forestry and background in horticulture as well. But because there's so much covered tonight, I can't go on and on about all that. We're going to talk about managing woodlands, buckthorn and beyond, and the reason it says beyond is for a very, very reason, because it's not just about buckthorn. It's a lot more. And so you're going to get a big background. Because I have a degree in forestry, I have to tell you about the forestry portion of what's happening in the ecosystem. So I'm going to have a bit of an interesting introduction. Most people say it's interesting, and I hope it is. And so I'm going to start out with, oh, thank you for coming. We have some people that just walked in. I'm going to dim the lights a little bit. You do that for me? So here we have the state of Minnesota. And you can see three different distinct regions in Minnesota. These are called ecoregions. So I'm going to give you a little background about this map. At the time that Minnesota was being settled, European settlers, about 1850 or so, they were cutting down a lot of timber in the northern Minnesota. And they had to do a land survey to know where all that timber was. And the really wonderful thing that they did when they did the land survey was take all kinds of information about the habitats. Was it a wetland? Was it an oak forest? They took information about the trees, the shrubs, the herbaceous plants, everything, which was fantastic. So about 1930, Professor Marshner from the University of Minnesota compiled all that data and put it into a very complex map. This is a simplified version of the map that he put together. The original map is at the University of Minnesota, and it's about 8 feet tall, and it's got all kinds of colors. But the main point to get here is that not very many states in the United States have three different ecological regions within one state. So here we have the western portion of the state that was originally prairie. So you've got different shades of yellow. Those are different types of prairie. We have moist prairie, we have dry prairie, we have gravel prairie, all kinds of different types. But if it's that color, oops, let me go back. There we go. So we go to Wisconsin. No. We go to North and South Dakota over here. They were all some type of prairie, and all the way west we have the grazing land. The prairie in the United States of America has less than 0.1% left. It's been converted to grazing land. It's been converted to crops. Prairie roots grow very deep, and the living and dying of those prairie roots for 10,000 years after the glaciers receded created some of the best black dirt in the whole entire globe. So we have it used to be called the breadbasket of the world here, which is why our agriculture is so popular. Well, of course, so successful in the United States, because the deep-rooted plants that went down 12 feet created just beautiful black dirt. So it's been converted. Then we also have the northeastern whole section, which was mostly conifer forest. And prior to settlement, there were big, huge white pine trees and red pine trees and a lot of others. And that was the huge logging era that happened. And so that forest has been converted mostly to what's called second growth. And second growth is mostly spruce and fir and birch and aspen. And those are just rotated and harvested and make all of our paper products, our toilet paper, newspapers, everything that you can think of, oriented strand board lumber. So they continue to harvest that, but it's a different composition. So we also have the central hardwood forest, and it's a transition between the prairie and the conifer forest, and that's where we are now. And so I'm going to zoom into Minnetonka. I'm going to show you that there's two distinct colors here in the central hardwood forest. There's the brown. The brown colors are some type of oak forest. There's lots of different kinds of oak forest. There's a oak woodland, brushland, moist oak woodland, dry oak woodland, all kinds of oak savanna, And then the green areas were big woods. And those were forests that were actually, back up, the brown forests that were oak dominated evolved with fire. And so prairie fires would run from the west into the woods, and they have evolved that way. And so there's a different regime of species there than there would be in the big wood forest, which does not have too much fire associated with it. And that's usually sugar maple and basswood, where all the sugar bushes were, where people would make maple syrup, things like that. Well, guess what? Where we are in Minnetonka just happens to be right on that dividing line. So you have a little piece of paper that shows you 3 counties and some colored sections on it. So if you look at the dividing line, you get to pick out Hennepin County. You pick out Hennepin County. Hennepin County is right here. And here's Lake Minnetonka. And here's Grays Bay Marina. The city of Minnetonka only gets that much of Lake Minnetonka, Grays Bay Marina. So, and here's Highway 101. So, boy, I'm not used to using clickers, am I? So, we're kind of right on the dividing line between 2 distinct habitat types, which means when you're taking out your buckthorn, you've got a lot to choose from. If you want to replant, you can take both habitat types. All right? So, I'm going to zoom in closer and show you that this is now, so you see those, that sheet that you have that's brown and green, that is full, it's fully forested and native habitat. The Minnesota Biological Survey the DNR had botanists that covered the whole entire state and surveyed it all over again. They did it, it was in the 1800s, and then they did it again in 1990. And the areas that you see, not used to this. Areas that we see in brown colors are the native habitats that remain. So here's Grays Bay Marina and Minnetonka. You don't see much color there. Now that's a little bit deceiving. Here's what we really have. So in 2004, the city hired a botanist to comb the city of Minnetonka and see where the remnant habitats remain in Minnetonka. And this is what came up from the Minnesota our Minnesota Land Cover Classification System, the MLC. And so these are where we have native habitats in Minnetonka. And you'll notice that Lone Lake Park is over here, big habitat. We've got Purgatory Park there, nice habitat. Big Willow, Civic Center, the headwaters of Minnehaha Creek. So our parks actually have a lot of really good habitat in them, and we've had habitat restoration going on for upwards of 20, 25 years in some of them, but buckthorn always coming back, right? But I just wanted to show you we do have some remnants, and what is positive, I mean, we've lost a lot, but the cool thing, the thing that doesn't show up on those maps, is that raise your hand if you have a ½ an acre or more land. Right, yes. And keep your hand up if you have a portion of your land that has never been bulldozed. When they made, there we go, bingo, this is great. So you have really good restorable habitat on your property if it's never been bulldozed. If it's full of buckthorn and you've got some oak trees, maybe some aspen trees, you can cut your buckthorn down and you'll be finding some native plants that are going to come back because nobody scraped off that top layer. And the top layer still has remnant roots and seeds from a long time ago. It has bad seeds from the buckthorn. So that means there's a lot of work to do in the future, but it means that it's a restorable habitat. So the next thing I want to show you is, this is the only time I'm going to talk about the big woods. So we talked about the green on the map and the brown. This is the green portion. And it goes from Mankato in the south. So here we are, Minneapolis, and Lake Minnetonka is right in here. Here's Minnetonka. And Monticello on the north, and Mankato in the south, and over here is Northfield and beyond. This is the big woods region, the sugar maple basswood, the sugar bush from years ago. The Native Americans made, it was very, very important for their livelihood to make maple syrup. Anyway, the light green is what was here pre-settlement, and the dark green is what remains today. Now, that sounds a little discouraging, but here is a really good graphic from the DNR that shows the kind of tree cover that we had in the past. This is the kind of tree cover we have now because it's been mostly, a lot of it's been converted to agriculture and roads. But this is what's possible in the future. And the thing that I think is so amazing is that we have an example of this at Lone Lake Park and our parks that have been undergone restoration. So anybody familiar with Lone Lake Park, been in a Lone Lake Park? Okay. Anybody remember that there used to be a ski slope in Lone Lake Park? I mean, it was not as wooded in Lone Lake Park as it is now. There used to be a downhill ski slope by the big water tower there. And so now that whole entire hillside is just full of trees. Well, where did they all come from? They came from other areas that were left, and it was allowed to seed in. So if you pretend that this is Lone Lake Park, what happened was that there are seeds that came from adjacent areas and filled in some of the areas. So these are original areas. So we have the County Biological Survey, and that map I showed you that was a little discouraging is right here, as anyone can look at it later. When they came through in the County Biological Survey in 1990, they did not put anything in Minnetonka on the map as significant habitat because it was all infested with buckthorn. But when they came back and visited a couple of years ago and saw the restoration that had happened there, they put it back on the map as habitat that's left over. So it's just an encouraging story to tell you that you can make a big difference on your property and give you a little better feel for what's going on here. All right, so now you have to know that if you're going to work on buckthorn on your property, that invasive species are always a problem, always. And when you start cutting buckthorn, there's always going to be something happening because a disturbance in the forest, nature abhors a vacuum. So if you take something out, something wants to be there. And it's usually something nasty because there's a seed bank of some bad things that have been moving all over the place. And so when we are cutting buckthorn in Minnetonka, we're always automatically taking out the non-native honeysuckles, a whole host of honeysuckles, and we take those out as well. And so the practices that I'm talking about here work for those other species that are invasive besides. There's a lot of things that come in. Raise your hand if you know what garlic mustard is. Okay, and raise your hand if you've got it on your property. Okay, so we're be talking about both of those because we have an ecosystem here, and you can't do one thing in a vacuum and expect it not to have a reaction. And so we're going to talk about buckthorn and removing invasive species, but we're also going to talk about shifting gears to garlic mustard later on in the season. You have to constantly, when you start a project removing invasive species, you have to be constantly monitoring to see what's coming in. So we've got garlic mustard on the lower right, we've got burdock on the lower left. All right, so I made some assumptions. I'm going to go through this really fast. That you're a residential owner, so I did find out about that. I expected more park volunteers to be here, but basic knowledge of buckthorn ID, I cannot assume that. So how many people would like to go over some twig and bud ID for buckthorn? Okay, two people. Okay, so I really read body language, so I'll try and go through that part a little bit fast. I've got some handouts that I gave you that I know for sure that you need. I used to be giving this buckthorn workshop a long time ago where there were more facts about where buckthorn came from, why it's bad, a whole bunch of information that most people don't need anymore. But I just want you to know that before we leave today, if you've got questions, please do ask. If you have questions now, because it's being filmed, we'll hold off and have the questions at the end. I hope you can remember them, and I'll stay as long as you have questions, and we'll probably, hopefully, keep recording as well, because you've got a question, everybody else does too, and it might be something that I missed, but it's pretty common. So I'm hoping that if you hire someone to remove your buckthorn, that you're going to have some really good questions to ask the contractor when you're done with this class, because there's some people that have certain methods that you really don't want on your property. How many people have slopes on your property? We have a lot of slopes in Minnetonka. Okay, you're the right people to be, definitely the right people to be. Glad you are. All righty. So here we go. So some leaf and bud and twig arrangement. The buckthorn bark looks very much like chokecherry and black cherry and American plum, and so if you hire a contractor and you're out there in the wintertime, which is a really good time to remove buckthorn, and you're asking them questions, how do you tell the difference between cherry and buckthorn in the wintertime? You know, if they say, oh, I go by the bark, forget it. They don't know what they're doing. Forget it. You have to go by the buds and the twig arrangement and the leaf arrangement. Now the leaf arrangement and the bud arrangement are really the same. So here so this is, you can tell that this is taken in late summer because the fruit on female buckthorn ripens in late summer. So it's after August, it's August or later. And later in the summer, the buds form. They're not formed right away in the springtime. So if you go out on your property this weekend or this coming week when it's going to be really nice, you can look at the buds and you can find these opposite buds, meaning they're right opposite one another on the twig. That is very distinct about buckthorn, but they have a couple little caveats in there too. They can also be subopposite, which means just offset a little bit like that, okay? So that's typically what you find. Now the buds, okay, so these leaves will fall off in the fall and they'll go over winter, and in the springtime, those buds will break and then you'll have twigs that grow. And those are opposite or subopposite. You can see that in the winter. Opposite or subopposite. It's these little ones that are only, a year old that are really wicked, really wicked. I usually have my buckthorn pointer stick of science instead. Okay, so what happens also is that the first thing in the spring, when the buds break and it starts to leaf out, the very first thing that happens is that these flowers are right around the stem. I'm showing you the fruit. So the flowers get pollinated, and then they turn into fruit later on. They'll look like little peas on the plants in the summertime until they ripen black. So they're always real close to the twig because they don't grow out on the terminal end. If you had a nannyberry, there'd be blackberries, but they'd be right out on the end of the twig. That's the distinction. Alrighty. Then the sample that I wish I had for you right now is where the buck and the thorn name comes from. So you see here, these two buds together look like the hoof print of a buck, don't they? Like, see that? So if you know what a deer print looks like in the snow. And then usually there's a little thorn that projects right out from that. Now you've got a handout that shows you the buck and the thorn. So if you look at the little one that's got the Buckthorn Identification, there's two different kinds of buckthorn. There's common buckthorn, which is extremely common in Minnetonka, and much less common is the glossy buckthorn, which is usually found in a wetland or wetland areas or adjacent to wetland areas. But on the left-hand side, you see that little box that shows these almost blackish buds that look like the hoof print of a deer. Can you see that? And then there's a thorn coming out of it. Sometimes the thorn is not that long. Sometimes it's half that long. And that is pretty wicked if you get it stuck under your skin. But so now when you are out looking at your plants and you can't find that buck and thorn, just look more around on the end. Look at branches that are out in the sunshine. Look at ones that are out on the side. The ones that are shady are going to be less distinct. There's always irregularities in nature. So for example, right here, these are opposite, but somehow, I thought that this one was missing, but I can actually see it going back here. But sometimes a bud just gets knocked off by some reason. And so if you don't see what you're looking for, just look around the plant some more. And if you find one bud that looks like this, the hoof print and the thorn in it, you know that whole plant is buck. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so the females have the fruit, not the males. So there's called dioecious. There are some plants that have male and female flowers on separate plants, and some of them have them all together. And so later on, we'll talk about priorities, which is getting the females. It's overwhelming to have a huge property full of buckthorn, and I'm hoping that in this class you're going to learn you do not have to do it all once. You can have priorities, and you can take time and be satisfied that you're doing the right thing and you're making a difference and you don't have to be in a panic about it. So outline for this presentation, it's a lot. It's really comprehensive. We're going to talk about the range of management, books and references, what woodland structure is and loss of species and how that is, you've already seen that. Native woodland shrubs that you can use to replace buckthorn. A whole bunch of common errors during buckthorn removal. Best techniques for the site, the actual getting down and how you do it. Restoring suppressed native plants that you find, the remnant ones. Preventing erosion. They're sloped all over Minnetonka. And if we do understory clear cuts, we can set up our sites to erosion and do more harm than good. So we're going to protect ground cover species, protect from deer and rodents, woodland ground covers and wildflowers, and wood waste utilization. Oh my gosh, then I'm going to do a summary that tells you the top priorities because there's an awful lot covered. So I'm going to go through this kind of fast because if I went to school and this was my degree program, I have to tell you, give you this graphic that shows you there's this whole range of what you can do with buckthorn. There's what I think is the right way, but there's some things that I believe are definitely unacceptable, and that is doing nothing. And the other one is an understory clear cut. And then there's a whole range in between here where there are really acceptable methods that you can use. And that's where we're going to focus today. People are doing nothing, are overwhelmed, can't beat it. They're actually land managers who say that I don't have enough budget and I don't have anything, I can't do it. Well, you've always got in the winter. There's the understory clear cut, and that's usually somebody who wants to improve their view or just make it look neat. But that's not understanding the ecological systems and what harm that can be, especially on a slope. So what we're going to do is talk about the areas between there and focus on the practical measures, the prioritized goals. Oh my gosh, I wish I had a pointer stick. Yeah, the prioritized goals that are knowledge-based. Prioritize, so you know what's the most important thing to do first. You prioritize it so that you don't have to do it once and get totally overwhelmed. Now we have full-scale ecological restoration out at the Cullen Preserve, where there are all kinds of big-scale restoration. Then there can be the garden arboretum kind of restoration. That's kind of expensive, where you have a beautiful forest. You want to incorporate native plants, and you want to incorporate hostas and some other ornamental plants, just like you have out at the arboretum, and that's a very good option as well. We're going to focus right here in the middle. All right, and so I just explained that. I'm going to go through that. So the focus today is reducing buckthorn and other invasive species, because there's a whole bunch that come together. Reducing erosion, increasing woodland structure and habitat for wildlife, for insects, for birds, for pollinators, all kinds of things. Increased plant species diversity, and the benefits in the whole food web. The whole food web. That's all that's interconnected, even the organisms in the soil, can be affected by the work that you do on your property. Oh. I'm going to start out by one really good reference. Daniel Wolfcha, who works for the DNR, wrote this book with a few other folks called St. Croix River Valley Anoka Sandplain, and he studied Anoka inside out, backwards, and upside down. And he wrote a number of fact sheets from all the plants that were found in the different habitat types in Anoka. Now, Anoka County is right next to there, and so we can extrapolate everything from Anoka and move it to Minnetonka, except that we don't have super sandy soils and water table, but it doesn't matter. All those plants still grow here. They're all in the same ecological region. So it's really interesting. If you really want to see your forest type, you know that you're originated in either a big woods forest or some kind of an oak forest, but he's got fact sheets that tell you what is in all the different layers in those different forest types, which is pretty cool. And in his book, encompasses these different 5 habitat types that are in Anoka. So in the Anoka County Sandplain, I'm surprised, not very much prairie, but guess what? It's savanna and woodlands. So savanna is basically a prairie with scattered trees. And that was the most dominant type of habitat in Anoka County. They had some forests, they have marshes and meadows and swamps, and they all interconnect, and you know that because you see that when you're driving around the city of Minnetonka. But the sad thing is, when you look at this is how much of that original habitat is left. Yikes, that's the same here. But the good thing is that your property wouldn't show up on a graph like this. Your property has the unbulldozed part of your property that they never scraped clear when they put your house in, has got remnant habitat that can fit into these categories. And that's the cool thing for me. So if you wanted to get into it even deeper than Daniel did with his fact sheets, the Minnesota DNR has 3 books for the 3 regions I showed you in Minnesota, those 3 ecological regions. There's a book for each one, and it's not got a lot of colored, wonderful pictures. It's a lot of tables of plants and species. So I mean, if you wanted to really get into it, you could look up all the different habitat types. I just want you to know this book. So we're talking about woodland structure. That's a forestry term. And you need to know when you're taking out your buckthorn that you don't want to do an understory clear cut, because all those layers are very important for the ecosystem, all these organisms. There are some birds in the summertime live right in the top of that canopy, and they'll sing all. Those are the veeries. And there's others that will occupy different layers in the canopy, and there's animals and birds that will actually nest on the ground. So you need all these different layers. The canopy layer is, of course, the most dominant tree species that are out there, and they have their leaves in the full sun. Those are the canopy species, and they define what kind of forest it is. You know, if it's dominant oak and aspen, then it's going to be an oak-aspen woodland. If it's sugar maple and basswood and elm, it's going to be the big woods. Those kind of things. If it's like prairie savanna, it would be white oak and bur oak. Anyway, and so the different types, all those colors you saw in the mosaic of that Minnesota map, all have different percentages of canopy, understory, and the herbaceous layer. The understory is also called the shrub layer, and that can be varying densities. It's normally shade-tolerant species that can grow in the shade of the canopy tree. That would usually be ironwood. If anyone's got an ironwood on your property, you've got a treasure. They grow really, really slowly. An ironwood this big in diameter could be 80 years old. Extremely dense wood. We've got quite a few of them in Minnetonka. Pagoda dogwood grows in the understory. A lot of different shrub species. Certain habitats will have not so much in the understory, but a really dense herbaceous layer. The herbaceous layer is on the ground. It's wildflowers and sedges and seedlings of the forest of the future. So a couple of examples here. Oh, this is the bad example. This is from my neighborhood. And here is the worst case scenario, and that's all buckthorn. So you can look into the future here. First, you're looking at the herbaceous layer. You don't see any herbaceous, no wildflowers, no sedges. And then you look into the future. You don't see any shrubs. You don't see any seedlings of shrubs, and you don't see any oak seedlings or sugar maple seedlings or basswood seedlings. And that says the future is kind of gloom in a place that looks this bad. Places you can find those in Minnetonka are many times the city outlot, where the city owns a piece of property and there's a drainage pond for storm drainage in the street, and those aren't restored. You know, there's vegetation there. It's growing. It's occupying space, but those are some of the worst places that we have in the city. Places we have are in a park. So you can see the future. Here's another. Here's a really good example. If you want to really see layers and different forest types, go to our state park. And I bet a bunch of you have gone to state park, right? Our state parks. That's where you can really see a functioning ecosystem and forest type with all the layers and a host of different species. And so this is at Charlie State Park. This was from the Minnesota Conservation Volunteer years ago. That is way out of the picture here, way up above. The understory is there. You can see there's a shrub layer and just an dense layer of wildflowers on the ground. The wonderful thing about our state parks is that there's not just one species that's purple at one time of year, then that species dies down and then something else comes up and then something else, and it's just this continuous transition of wonderful species. So this is a good place to see what we have had. Now this really made a big impression on me when I saw this in the 1990s. It just was, you know, how sometimes the light bulb goes on, it really goes on. This was Applied Ecological Services put this graphic together, and it just perfectly illustrates what has happened since European settlement. So we've been here. The Europeans colonized in like the 1850s, so we've been here for about 170 years, is that right? Yeah, something like that. Anyway, so when we got here, there was mostly oak woodlands, and lots of them were much more open than this because prairie fires were dominating. They really ran through a lot, and the Native Americans used fire to manage the landscape as well. There were natural fires, and then there were prescribed burns all that time ago. And then when we suppressed fire, then fill up in the forest. In forest, when there's not fires, there's more forest. If we've got enough moisture, the forest trees. Then buckthorn came in and just globbed onto the understory, and they were so aggressive, a lot of the native species started to disappear. And if you look at the native plants, 300, and then dropping down and dropping down and dropping down, this is truly what has happened. If we go out onto an outlot in Minnetonka, well, those areas I told you about that aren't managed at all, literally, you cannot find 35 different species. You cannot find. It's really sad, and almost all of them are invasive. So this is kind of gloomy. When I moved into my house, I had a lot of species come into my bird feeder, and I've definitely seen this happen at my backyard. I've got about 4 species that I see on a regular basis, but I used to have something more like this. And so it's just interesting. I'm not trying to depress you, but you have power to do and make more habitat and do that graphic that you saw earlier. You can fill in some of those spaces and improve. Well, so now what I want to show you is that this truly exists. I mean, this looks pretty depressing. I'm going to show you this, and this, all here in real life. Okay, here we go. So this is the first buckthorn cut at Big Willow Park. They took the whole understory out for the most part, and native aster species came up. So that ground layer, herbaceous layer's got asters in it, and we've got the canopy layer, and we've got a very weak understory layer because they had big machinery came in and they took most of the understory out. But in the last 15 years, we've been working hard to get choke cherries to come back, and the gray dogwoods, and more of that middle layer on the outside edge. Then we have, this is a couple blocks from my house, and this is a trail. And oops, here we go again. We have a trail, and we have an oak aspen forest that the whole understory is completely clogged, and you've probably seen things like that. Alrighty, and that's where I took that picture, that really bleak picture of the herbaceous layer. Came from this woods. And then this is over behind Minnetonka High School, where we've got Dutch elm disease, we've got oak wilt, and now we have the emerald ash borer. And those are big threats to our canopy, our tree canopy. And this is a very good illustration of the canopy disappearing. And what's left is buckthorn, and we've got some little bit of dogwoods in the front and some willows. And so the canopy's gone. So we really need to manage our woodlands, and so I'm so glad that you are here. Thank you for being here. So here's the woodland edge. Back in my neighborhood, buckthorn loves the woodland edge. It thrives there. And the fruit is all produced on the outside edge, and then the birds carry it to the interior. The birds, it's not a good food source for the birds. It is a starvation diet. So in the fall, when the birds are migrating south, they will strip all the native plants clear. So we've got gray dogwoods that have nice white berries in the fall. They just get ripped as they go south, and all the blackberries remain on the buckthorn. Yeah, the time that they're usually eating the most is when they come back in the spring, when the robins are coming back, and nothing else is around except for maybe some of our crab apples. But then they're eating starvation food, and that goes through their system pretty quickly. I usually have my buck. Margie can help me. Because this isn't. You are the best. You are the best. Thank you. I don't know how that happened. All right. So what's supposed to be there? So the whole edge of this woodland, this is a really nice woodland in Bloomington where I live. It's oak forest. It's got hickory trees in it. What's supposed to be there? It's supposed to be full of a whole diversity of plants. Choke cherries. We've got 3 species of cherry that grow in Minnetonka: choke cherry, black cherry, pin cherry. A whole bunch of dogwoods. We've got red osier dogwood, gray dogwood, pagoda dogwood, silky dogwood, all kinds of dogwoods. We have American plum, all these plants that produce a whole host of flowers, pollen, nectar for our pollinators that are later produce fruit, and they're all staggered at different times. So we've got elderberries and American plums that blooming first thing in the spring, and then there's this continuum that's constantly blooming throughout the rest of the season, which is really good for not only the birds but the pollinators. And then there's that whole food web that we used to call the food chain many years ago, but they're all interconnected. And so what we need is that diversity that is being lost. So I want to talk about Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. This was a big wake-up call for me. You know, another one of those light bulb moments. You know, I was always focusing so much about the fruit and how important the fruit was for songbirds? Yes, it is. For migratory songbirds that are going south, the fruit is really important. But guess what? In the summertime, when they are raising babies, they've got new little hatchlings that just hatch out of out of the eggs, and they've got baby birds to feed. What do they need to feed them? They're not feeding them fruit. They want protein. They need protein for growth. That means they need to get caterpillars. So this bringing nature home is fantastic. There's an entomologist that wrote this book, and there's a page here that really is eye-opening. That talks about the top 5 species that are native butterflies and moths feed on the leaves. And so the butterflies and moths lay the eggs hatch, the caterpillars start eating the leaves. They have evolved together on this continent for thousands of years, 10,000s of years of evolution where they've been coexisting and have checks and balances so that they live together just fine. So there's 400 species of Lepidoptera, which are moths and butterflies, 400 for cherry. So for chokecherry and black cherry and plum, 448 species. So all those species have caterpillars, and the birds are up there gleaning the caterpillars off and feeding them to their young. Isn't that interesting? So we've got oak is the number one, 517 species of Lepidoptera feed on oak trees. So those are really, willows are up in the top 5, birch and poplar. Poplar, which is aspen or poplar. So that was huge. That was huge to me to learn that, but this is a fantastic book if you want to read about the kind of things that we are doing and can do to make a big difference. Make a big, big difference. So, what else? So, when I went through all of those, you saw the Anoka study of Anoka County, all those fact sheets that were in that book. I went through all of them and found the most common plants that are in those plants for buckthorn. You got a handout on this today, because I know Margie made those copies today. You have a list of shrubs. Get those today? A list of shrubs that are good replacement plants for buckthorn? You did. Maybe. If you didn't, it could be in here. Oh, there we go. Margie's going to hand these out. Thank you so much. Maybe. So this slide is coming in a handout to you just now. And so you know that we have dry oak forest, mesic oak forest, maple basswood forest. You could take anything off of this list. You just pay attention. If it came from a maple basswood forest, you wouldn't want to plant it on your south-facing slope, right? Because that would be really dry. You probably have a north-facing slope or an east-facing slope, and you probably add mulch. Make sure that you watered it during the drought. Does that make sense? If it came from a moist area. If it was a dry area, you could be more. Does that make sense? I don't want to get too many details. Anyway, these are really good replacement plant lists. Okay, so now common errors during buckthorn removal. Oh my gosh, there's so many errors. This is one of those clear cuts that I was telling about. Now, where would clear cut be acceptable? Now, if you were going to be restoring real prairie and real savanna and really intensively managing, like they're on top of all the weeds, burning it on a regular basis, weeding constantly, putting the proper seeds down, that is acceptable as long as it's not on a steep slope, okay? But if you do this and you're on a steep slope and you're not going to be managing it intensely, you are setting it for kind of a mess. So we call brushing, and many times crews will be sent out to brush if there's brush that's encroaching on the trail or something like that. But then we have the following growing season, we've got a lot of stuff that comes back up growing. And some of it's weeds and some of it's good. If it's a native habitat that hasn't been bulldozed, there's probably wildflowers in there and there's weeds in there. If it's not an actively managed area, somebody's going to think it's weedy, come in and weed whack it all down, and then the wildflowers disappear too. So that's not so great. That's great management. We have to pay more attention. Whenever we have a disturbance, a lot of nasty stuff comes in. So we've got a lot of seeds that have been transported all over, all the continents, all the places, and we've had development everywhere. And so we've got a lot of nasty stuff. This is a project that happened a couple blocks from my house. Somebody hired a contractor to cut down the buckthorn, and this is what came in afterwards. So you don't want stuff like that to happen. So we're going to we're going to work on that. There's just a whole host, huge whole host of invasive species that come in to disturbance. Nature abhors a vacuum. So it's not going to stay bare dirt. There's no way. Something's going to grow there. And so you've got to be able to figure out what's good and what's not good. All right. So here is Bob here from Prospect. Lives near Prospect Trail. He signed up? No. All right. So this is Prospect Trail in Minnetonka. It's not too far from Grays Bay Marina and the headwaters. There was a volunteer who was doing some buckthorn work there. And then there were some crews that were doing some work in there. And they cut down the buckthorn and the garlic mustard went crazy. Now, because I don't want to take too much time, and we do have a garlic mustard workshop that's going to come up in May. And we also have a garlic mustard workshop that I did on the computer that you can get on YouTube. I'm not going to talk about it too much. But it's really important if you've got garlic mustard on your property, and it's all over Minnetonka, and you get to May 1st of every year, you stop doing your buckthorn work for sure, and you start combing your property for garlic mustard. You can come to that workshop or watch it online on YouTube and learn about that species. But this is a ground cover of garlic mustard. You look at, hard to see, but right here there's some tan-colored little seed tops. So the garlic mustard was really tall in this nice opening, had a party and distributed gazillions of seeds. It means there's going to be a big future of garlic mustard coming up in that spot. So I've got more pictures of garlic mustard, and these are the stalks that you can see in the snow in the wintertime. So if you're cutting in the winter and you see these stalks, oh boy, maybe we're not going to cut it all out right away. Maybe we're going to leave some shade. Then we'll go get the females out first, and then we'll work on the garlic mustard, and then next year we'll do some more, and then we'll keep working on our garlic mustard. It has it's a biennial plant. If this is it's a little rosette. The first year, it looks a lot like violets. The second year, it sends up a flowering stalk and flowers, and that's the perfect time to get rid of it, and that's about May 1st every year. So then you stop all your buckthorn work. That's a different workshop. So, and those are the seed pods. You definitely do not want to let it go to seed. If it goes to seed, oh boy, then you've got a lot of years that you've got to be pulling garlic mustard, because those seeds remain viable in the soil for at least 11 years. Yeah, you're going to have to be pulling it every year. So back to the cutting, the understory clear cut. So if you're doing brushing, there's a lot of people that talk about low value species. Well, that elm is going to get Dutch elm disease, so we're going to cut that down. And the ash, well, that's going to get emerald ash borer, so I'm going to cut that. And they just cut everything down. But guess what? If it's holding soil in place, picture this on a slope. If it's holding soil in place, it has value. If you don't have a boatload of money to immediately have the whole entire area landscape, and you want to spend a little less money, because sometimes this buckthorn removal costs up to $6,000 an acre. It's really expensive to remove by contract. So you want to have it be more natural. You can leave the native plants grow back in, and over time, as you want to plant what you want to be growing there, you could do that and then be removing the other species out you don't want. You want to definitely be keeping the native species. Some people call them undesirable, but they're pioneers. The forestry term for plants that come in after disturbance, after wind throw or fire or clear cutting, are pioneer species, the ones that distribute really easy, like the helicopters of the silver maple and the cotton of the cottonwood, and the things that distribute, and they seed very readily. So there's those ones that I mentioned already. And so I changed the color of this just today. Saving the native species is equally as important as removing the buckthorn, especially if you are cutting on a slope. Now we're going to talk about invasive versus aggressive. I didn't even talk about the definition of invasive. The definition of invasive is a plant that evolved on a different continent where we live. So think of the European continent or the North African continent, and then think of the continent. Our North American plants for the last 10,000 years after the glaciers receded co-evolved together. So they're feeding on them, and the plants make reactions to the feeding. They might make some toxins so they don't get eaten as much, and then the animals will get adapted to that. And so there's this checks and these balances that are happening, and all these organisms are evolving together, and they kind of live in sort of a balance. If you bring a plant or an animal from another continent and introduce it, Sometimes it's no problem at all, and sometimes it can get way out of whack, as you know. Then there can be a plant that comes over like garlic mustard and like buckthorn that nothing eats it. So the deer don't eat it, and the rabbits don't eat it, and the rodents don't eat it, and the insects don't feed on it. Nothing eats it. All of a sudden, it's got this huge advantage. It can come in and proliferate and take over the native plants because the native plants co-evolved with our native insect, and then there's less native plants, more invasive plants, and then the native organisms are feeding on our native plants even more heavily. And so the native plants. Does that make sense? So the invasive species didn't come from here. Now people like to say sumac is invasive, and then say American elm is invasive, and green ash is invasive. No, they're aggressive. They're native species that evolved here. They have a place in forest succession. They're pioneers. They're the first ones that start, and then later on, forest succeeds itself and creates a more mature forest without getting into that too deeply. So the pioneer species have a place. Prickly ash, people think that it's invasive. Well, it is pretty aggressive. It's pretty aggressive. But if you have nothing to replace it with right away, I would suggest to you to keep it for the time being because you don't want that clear cut. Okay? I think I covered all that. Alrighty. So here's an example. When I was in college, and that corridor I showed you with the horrible understory, I was so frustrated, and I didn't have I'm a college student, and it drove me crazy, all this buckthorn's there, and I asked my city if I could do some volunteer buckthorn control, and they allowed me to do it, but I didn't have a chainsaw, and I didn't have a crew, and so I did some really, really small work, but I girdled some plants, and then just watched what was coming up, and fostered. If you've heard people that you want to just let your yard go natural, there are people that want to let their yard go natural. That worked, 50 years ago, but maybe even 30 years ago. But you can't let your yard go natural anymore. You really got to pay attention to what's coming in. So if you let things go natural, you got to take out the invasive stuff and leave. So this is an aggressive go natural corner for the natives. The invasive species have been taken out, but everything that's there is aggressive. And if you want something that's maintenance, there you are. Sumac, goldenrod is the most aggressive prairie species that we have. We've got woodbine, which we're going to talk a bunch about vines here. There's wild raspberries and grapes, but it's all native, and it's low maintenance. Just an example. All right, what else do we have on that list? We're going to talk about this next. Box elder, cottonwood, box elder. People love to hate box elder, but it has ecosystem functions. It definitely does. It's good for pollinators. And if you live in Nebraska or Wyoming and there aren't any trees, a box elder is not a bad plant, not a bad tree. Anyway, so now we're going to talk about the vines. These are the two most common vines we have in our woodlands, and people just love to rip out all the vines. So we're going to talk about those next. So here we have, this is the same corner. We've got wild grape. Sometimes people call it frost grape or riverbank grape. Very easy to tell because it's got a big leaf, kind of looks maple-like, big leaf. And we've got the grapes in the fall. They look like they're small. Then we have, this is very easy to identify, our native woodbine. The nursery trade calls it Virginia creeper. It's a palmate compound leaf. And so it's got all the leaflets coming from one central spot, turns scarlet red in the fall if it's in the sunshine, and it turns pink in the woods if it's on the ground. The neat, very cool thing about this plant is that if you've got a lot of garlic mustard in your woodland, and you probably have this plant because it's a pretty aggressive native plant, not nearly as aggressive as the grape, but this can be pulled down off of trees and spread out on the ground, and it can form a ground cover. And that is a replacement plant for garlic mustard. You don't want to spend a fortune, replacing the whole understory. It's a nice transition plant. Now, wild grape, on the other hand, they've done a university study up at Cedar Creek and found that wild grape has had a big reaction to the increased carbon in our atmosphere, and it's kind of going crazy. And so this plant can actually strangle some really good trees and valuable trees. So when we're doing habitat restoration, we look at each where it's growing, and if it's on a tree or a plant cage, we're going to take it out and we're going to stump treat it. But we're going to leave it grow wherever it's on a pioneer tree because it does have bird value for migratory songbirds. Cool. So next. So here we have the Virginia creeper as a ground cover in Kinzel Park. Isn't that beautiful? That used to be all garlic mustard. you have an adopt spot volunteer, then just pass the job over. But that, I'll take that over garlic mustard any day. You can, when it gets to be too dense and you want your wildflowers, you can, take them out, put something else in. That's a nice example. So here we have, now we're finally getting into buckthorn control methods. Okay, this is not the easiest method. The first one that I'm showing you is not the easiest method, but it's because I'm making a transition from the vines into control methods. So here we are, I'm a college student, and I don't have a chainsaw, and I'm going to do the frill method. So now, I want you to go to your yellow handout, and if we got down, some people have no, we didn't do those. Anybody have a white one with a yellow post-it note on top? A yellow post-it note? Okay, yes? Okay, if you got a yellow post-it note, that's your yellow handout. Okay, so this is your best handout. This has got everything that you need to go home with tonight. And if I miss something, it's in here, as far as having the core information about buckthorn control. Now, what we're talking about is the frill method right now. I want you to read every word on this when you get home, because this is so important. The devil is in the details with invasive species. And if you read all this, you are going to be so far ahead of everybody else in your neighborhood, and you're going to be able to ask all the right questions to the contractors if you want to get a contractor to help you. So if we go down to the second to the last paragraph on the page 1 of chemical control of buckthorn, we have the frill cuts with herbicide. And that's what this is. It's not the easiest method, but it's just an illustration to show you that if you've got vines climbing up on some buckthorn, it could be habitat. So this is just kind of an anecdote, and it's kind of fun. So I had woodbine, the red one, growing on one, and wild grape growing on the other. And if you were to kill the buckthorn and let it die and have the grapevines on top, you've got all this habitat for birds inside, right? The buckthorn's dead, and you've got this structure. You've got this structure and habitat. So that's just an illustration of that. Now the frill method you can use with a hatchet, or you can use with a butcher knife, but you're not going to be macho at all. You got to go just underneath the bark, not into the wood. So there's this narrow area, and the nice thing about buckthorn is that right underneath the bark, it's yellow and orange. So if you get into the white wood, you chopped too deeply. You want to get just underneath the bark so that you're getting into that yellow and orange stuff, okay? You have to go all the way around the whole perimeter. And then you have to have some kind of a way to get your herbicide, when we're going to talk more about herbicides, into that groove. So these little sponge brushes that you get at the hardware store are really good for getting into those little grooves. And then you can just leave it stand. It'll stand there for 5 or 6 years, and it'll eventually crash over. And the wood inside is just gorgeous, of those big ones. Now there's problems with that because there are a lot of buckthorn that are multi-stem. See this, where you've got 4 or 5 of them? It doesn't work very good because you got to get all the way around. So it's just kind of a novelty thing that you can do. If you've got a buckthorn that's standing on a steep slope and you want to keep those roots all there, well, we always want to keep it, but you just want to have some structure, and a dead tree is good habitat for birds, then the frill method is really good to watch them die. Okay? All right, now, sometimes, there we go. So you can see the following year that it died, but I didn't get all the way around one of the stems. So over here we have buckthorn leaves and fruit, so I missed that one. But all these over here are dead, and we've got Virginia creeper, and there was a bonus. There's our native bittersweet. Anybody familiar with bittersweet? You buy a clump this big of fruit for $15 at Bachman's, and it's pretty uncommon. Anyway, so bittersweet and sumac, and anyway, it worked, kind of a novelty. Going back here. So the frill method, I'm showing you Roundup. This is not an advertisement for Roundup. Roundup is off patent, and you can now buy it in all kinds of generic forms. So you go back to your yellow handout. On the back side of your yellow handout, we have herbicides that work well on buckthorn. Glyphosate is the first word. The first bullet says glyphosate. That's the active ingredient in Roundup, and you can buy kinds of different trade names. And you look for 18 to 20% active ingredient on the little label. Whatever, it's a law that every herbicide label has to have a little box down in the corner that tells you what the active ingredient is in fine print. And so you want to look for glyphosate as the active ingredient. Okay? It's going to be down in this corner. And then you got to look at the percentage. because it could be anywhere from 3% to 40% or more. And so you can buy, this is what you really have to pay attention to. If anybody's nodding off, you really got to pay attention to. So you can buy it usually in that 18% to 20% range, but sometimes it's 41%. So if it's 41%, you're going to have to dilute it halfway. Does that make sense? You're going to have to dilute it. So you have to put half water and half that herbicide into whatever you're going to use. Sometimes there's the ready-to-use weed spray. You got to look at the fine print because sometimes that's 3% because it's already been mixed up. That's what RTU is. Already, you're going to spray, you want to spray the weeds in your driveway or whatever. 3% is not going to kill a buckthorn stump. Okay, so you got to pay attention. But then you might find 10% that you can dilute. Oh my gosh, never mind. Too much information. Too much information. So there are contractors out there that will say glyphosate doesn't work. It's not strong enough. It doesn't work. I have to use triclopyr. There are also people that want to ban glyphosate. And it has been shown to show cancer, but we're not eating it, okay? We're not eating it. We are judiciously using it very carefully according to the label instructions, okay? We can't control buckthorn without herbicides. So we use it very carefully. And I'm going to show you some really cool new tools that are wonderful that made my life a lot better. So, but there are those that say, and I have to make this really clear, if you're going to hire a contractor and they're going to say that I'm going to use Garland, you do not have to use Garland. It's more toxic. It lives in Garland. Triclopyr is number 2. Triclopyr ester is the active ingredient in Garland. You don't need to know all that, but that it's more toxic. It will stay in the soil longer. The glyphosate will disappear from the soil very quickly. The half-life, it'll decompose very quickly, and it will not travel in the soil. And these other chemicals will travel in the soil, and they will be residual in the soil, and they will kill other things as well. We want to stay with the least toxic, and that's the glyphosate. Okay? That makes sense? Really easy. All right. No need to drill holes. Oh my gosh, there were so many labels in the past that used to say drill holes and put the herbicide. So how do you get the herbicide in there if you're drilling a hole? You need a syringe. Why would you do that? So method is not the easiest method, so we're moving on. Moving on here. Something else. We'll dive from the chemicals for a minute and talk about, wait, that's not buckthorn. There are people out there that are cutting all kinds of stuff that's not buckthorn. This is a nice, big, 3-inch diameter black cherry tree that's in the buckthorn brush pile. Oh my gosh, we have had contractors that have cut everything that does not look like buckthorn. Ironwood. I mean, and the cherry bark does look very much like buckthorn, so we don't go by the bark, right? We already talked about that. We're not going by the bark. We're going by the buds, leaves. Those leaves look nothing like buckthorn leaves, and you have your buckthorn leaf handout too. Help you out with that. What else? So I'm talking here, we've got, I used to flag things blue. I still flag things yellow. If we're doing a buckthorn cut, I will go through the woods and I'll flag the things that are native to keep so that they won't be cut out. Because when the chainsaw is going and the brush saws are going and they're ripping, lots of them just, there are some contractors that are very, very good and know their native plants, but there aren't that many. So I will go out and flag the things yellow for those of you who are old enough to remember tie a yellow ribbon around the toe. Yeah. You can buy this 1/2-inch stuff that's really easy. Anyway, this is yellow ribbon flagging. You can buy your own color, but and you can pick out the native plants. I'm showing this on the right to show you how much buckthorn and cherry look alike. And anyway, there we have contractors that have cut down cherry trees that are 5 inches in diameter and 40 feet tall because the bark looks like buckthorn. So just want to make you not have to do the same thing. So there's places that there's times that you can find those native plants very easily without being a native plant expert in identification. In the fall, when the native plants are turning color and the buckthorn is green, it's a perfect time to get up ribbon flagging and start flagging things. And those are, I'll talk later about that, the high priority to release, to cut around those first. Talk about that. Okay. You can use spray paint, whatever color code you want, as long as you know what you're doing, right? Okay, so here we are back to the Frill method again. And I want to emphasize to you that restoration, if you've got a lot of buckthorn, I want to show of hands of how many people got really dense buckthorn, big dense buckthorn on your property, okay? So when your buckthorn is old growth and has been there for a long time, it might be really hard to find native plants because they've been diminishing over all this time. because the native, I know some of that too. So you might find something that's really small. It might be this big. So when I started here 16 years ago, I was putting ribbon flags around cherries that were this big, that are now 15 feet tall and this big in diameter. It's taken 15 years for that, but that's restoration. So I want to show you here that this is a big buckthorn, and these are black choke cherries right here. If this one gets frilled, it's not going to leaf out this year, and these are going to get more sunlight. So these are going to take off, and this one's dying. So that's just my college student frill thing again, you know, because I didn't have a chainsaw. So just so you know, just showing you here, the white flag here is on gray dogwood, and the blue flag is on buckthorn, and that they're intermixed. Just to show you to pay attention to the twigs. There's Prospect Trail. This was when a crew was assigned to go in and clear the trail, and nobody went in and flagged in advance. I flagged this after the choke trees were cut, unfortunately. When you cut hardwoods and you don't treat the stump, they will sprout from the stump, and they'll be like a shrub. So if you see that this is a whole bunch coming out at one spot, somebody had cut that choke cherry years ago. They missed the stump with the herbicide. It regrew to 8 feet tall, and then it got cut again. That's really frustrating if you're trying to do restoration. But that's a really nice choke cherry clump that got taken out, and you can be sure that doesn't happen on your property, right? All right, here is choke cherry. Anybody ever seen something in your woods that looks like scat on a stick? Yeah, that is cherry black knot disease, and does not have to be fatal. The good thing about seeing it right now, you can go out in your woods this very weekend because we still have snow. It shows up really good in the wintertime. It's a disease that needs to be pruned out. Usually we'll prune it. Before you do the pruning, choke spreads by underground rhizomes and forms a thicket. Not all species do that. Some do. So some will form a thicket and it'll keep spreading. And so if you were to go 10 feet all the way around that choke blob you see there, and look at all the buds, you learn what the buds look like, and you put little ribbon flags on all the choke cherries that are in there, and they might be this tall. Then you come back to this one, you go 9 inches below or 10 inches, whatever, and you cut that out and you just leave it there. It's going to continue to resprout and regrow. And then cut out all the buckthorn in the area where you have all your ribbon flags, you just restore the choke cherries. Does that make sense? So you just seeing that one thing right there, that disease, and by the way, I hire somebody to prune cherry black knot out of our choke cherries in Minnetonka every single year, because when there's high moisture, there's more spores flowing around, and so it can kill your choke cherry if you leave it there forever, because then it'll just continue to grow down the stem. Is this too much information? I hope it's not. Anyway, that's how you can restore a choke cherry thicket, by just finding that blob out there, flagging the natives, and then clearing around them first. Alrighty, so next, more native plant ID. So in the fall, we have the choke cherries and the nanberries that are turning color, and all the buckthorn is still remaining green. Here's an area where we've taken out the buckthorn, and the others have flourished. So we have American hazel and sumac and gray dogwood, all very beneficial, fall color. That's 3 years later. Well, now we're talking about all these native plants. Where can you learn how to identify native plants? When I was in college, we did not have the Bible. But Welby Smith is a state botanist at the DNR, and he published this book, and it is fantastic. If you like plants, this book, oh my gosh, he's so good. He's so good. He's got them all arranged according to family, and there are photographs of everything. You got the twigs, you got the buds, you got the leaves, you got the flowers, you got the fruit, you've got the you've got the structure. He hired someone to do these illustrations of what the actual tree looks like. You've got the range maps. You have got where it grows in Minnesota and where it grows in the United States. It is a fantastic book. There are species that I couldn't identify until I got this book, because there's some that are so similar that you have to have a hand lens to see the differences in the flowers and things like that. And I can't recommend this enough. Fantastic book called Trees and Shrubs of Minnesota by Welby Smith. Okay. Of course, I don't plug volunteering unless there's volunteers in the because most people have their own buckthorn to take care of before they volunteer, but we have people who volunteer. You can learn with us. There's the Minnesota Native Plant Society has field trips, and it's free. And you can go out with botanists and learn plants on their plant walks. It's really wonderful. www.MNNPS. That's the Minnesota Native Plant Society.org. And they have free plant swaps. They have a little plant sale once a year. And I got a lot of plants on my property just from people who are digging things up on their property. Got too much one thing. Anyway, where you can learn some plants. All right. So more back to the common errors during buckthorn removal. Here is a stump that was not treated. And this was a contractor that got paid a lot of money. And the stump was missed. Well, how do you miss so many stumps? Well, we got leaves all over in the woods and we got snow. So if you're cutting in the fall, the leaves cover, you can't believe how fast they cover up. You cut something, you're right there, and all of a sudden your stump is missing. Where did the stump go? So yeah, that's a bummer when you don't treat the stump. Then you've got a lot of work to do again. So here, yes, I was hoping this would be the next slide. So a stump that's not treated, there's 19 resprouts at the base of this stump that have to be cut and treated. Treat this one, that's the main stump that was cut a long time ago because that's dead. But it resprouted in living tissue all around here that caused these sprouts. Every one of those needs to be treated. Every one. And so you're paying twice for the same work. You got to do it right the first time. So we have a new method in Minnetonka, and I hope I got the right slide here. Yes, I got it. So the new method is, this is the Minnetonka method for cut and stump treat. And cut and stump treat is the easiest way to control buckthorn. Of all the methods there are, and cut and stump treat is on your yellow sheet, right smack in the middle, right after the time to apply chemicals. Maybe we should talk about the time to apply chemicals first. The time to apply chemicals is any time from August all the way through fall, all the way through winter, and all the way up to the end of March, maybe just a little bit into April. The only time you don't want to cut stump treat is when the plant is starting to break bud and make new leaves and new stems. It's taking its energy out of the root system and pushing it up and out, and it does not take the chemical in very well. Anytime the temperature is above 35 degrees, above freezing, from August all the way through the winter, not this year, but most winters we have 40-degree days in the winter, and you're bored and you want to get outside and go cut down some female buckthorn, you can cut and stump treat as long as you stomp the snow down around the stump and you get the stump low enough. Now this is what you got to really pay close attention to, because this is where everybody messes up. There's like 4 or 5 ways you can mess up a stump treatment. You're at the wrong time of the year. I just told you, you don't treat between May and August because the plant is growing up and out, pushing everything upward. So you don't treat then. But guess what? You can be working on your garlic mustard at that time of the year. And so it's a perfect alternate. You didn't get your stump low enough. Some people will cut their stump this high and treat it, and the herbicide doesn't make it all the way down and through. You got to cut your stump low. About an inch off the ground is just fine. Half inch. The concentration isn't right. Maybe you got too low a concentration. That's number 3 that you could do wrong. And number 4 is you didn't apply it good enough. We've got contractors and we've got crew members that are out there that are just kind of blobbing it. And you come back and you go, no, you didn't get all the way around there. Well, we're going to look at stump treatment in a minute. I'm going to show you exactly where to apply it. But you're going to go around a few times. We're going to talk about the arbor as well. So those are 4 or 5 really important ways you can get it wrong. But here's the Minnetonka method of leaving a tall stump. So when you're cutting buckthorn and you're dragging brush and deciding what you're going to do with it, the stumps are getting lost under the leaves and under the brush, and people are trying to herbicide the stump and drag the brush at the same time. It is just a mess. It's a mess. And it's been going on for years and years and years and not being very effective. If you leave a tall stump and do what you want to do with the brush, you can chip it back into the woods if it doesn't have fruit on it. You can make windrows, which I'll show you photographs of, or you can haul it. You can bring it to the city brush drop, which is a free brush drop off from March all the way till November. And those are at least 3 ways that you can make things out of it. I'll show you that as well. but you're going to get your brush to wherever you want it to go, but you're going to leave the tall stump because what? You might be cutting in the wintertime when it's below freezing, and you can't treat below freezing. That's one good reason. You maybe have some help in the summertime when you're not supposed to be stump treating, but maybe you've got somebody coming in town that's going to help you work in the yard, and it's not the right time to be cutting and stump treating, but you're going to cut and leave it stump this tall so that later on in the fall you can make the final cut and treat. Does that make sense? If you're cutting at the wrong time for treating properly. But you're also getting all the debris out of there, and you're going to have two separate operations. One operation is cutting and getting the brush out. Yes, sir. Yes, I'm going to repeat that because we're getting filmed today. So yeah, I've been talking a lot of things really fast and mixed up, so I'm glad you asked me to clarify that. So you cannot stump treat from May to August, for example, but you can cut if you leave a tall stump. The stump is a reminder, oh, I got something else to do here. I got to come back and make that final cut and treat it at the proper time. So you can cut in the summertime, but you got to leave a tall stump and then come back when it's appropriate for stump treatment, make your final cut in the fall and treat it. Does that make sense? Okay, so there's a lot of, and the devil's in the details, isn't it? The devil's in the details. So this is a good method. So this is an old slide. This is back in the days, anyway, before we had Buckthorn Blaster Dog. So I'm showing you the old stuff. Before we did, I was doing it myself and I didn't have blue dye. So I had, if you are going to put herbicide in a container and treat your stump, you have to label it. It's a law that it has to be labeled. So when I started in Minnetonka, this is a Minnetonka stump. It's over by Burwell House, and I was just doing my own thing and just showing where you cut. When you've got a fresh cut stump, you cannot treat, you have to treat it right away that same day, okay? And got to be a fresh cut, just like a Christmas tree. And you're going to apply it right underneath, so on the top surface of the stump, right underneath the bark, right there. This is the cambium layer, and that's where you want, there's different parts. I'm going to explain this. The heartwood of a tree is not functioning at all for anything other than structure. The sapwood, which is the really light wood, conducts water upward from the root, going up. And the phloem is right underneath the bark, just a couple of cell layers thick, and it's bringing things down into the root. And so you've got to treat your herbicide right on this outer edge on the upper surface. And you've got a handout that shows blue dye, and we definitely recommend the blue dye because you can know what you've treated and what you haven't. So this is me 15 years ago, before we had Buckthorn Blaster Daubers, and I didn't have any herbicide dye in it, but that is the way you treat it. If you've got a crack, a lot of times Buckthorn has got multiple stems growing together, and if there's cambium in this crack, you've got to follow the crack all the way in. That makes sense? Great. That's the old way. Now, this is great because the Buckthorn Blaster Dauber was invented. A lot of people will spray their stumps. I've already had cancer, and I don't want anything to do with getting herbicides on my body or breathing it. And if you can smell it, you're breathing it. Okay? So this is called a wick applicator. A wick applicator is something that's got something spongy, and it's just going to go right into the stump. Now, the Blaster Dauber is absolutely fantastic, and it was invented right here in Minnetonka. And it's basically a bingo dauber. How many people have ever used one of these playing bingo? Okay? It's a bingo dauber. The gal who invented this ordered empty bingo daubers, put labels on them, and sells them for $6 a piece. And they are fabulous. They're absolutely fabulous. And it changed my life here because this is so easy. You're using way, way less chemical. You're not breathing spray. You're using almost nothing. So people want to get rid of glyphosate. You're using almost nothing. And you're not getting it on, anyway, all right. 1/2 a cup of mixed herbicide, you're going to have put 20% in this. 1/2 a cup will treat just a boatload of buckthorn, like most of, really long time. It's really easy. These things come with little tools that you can take the top piece off of. And because once you've gone through a half a cup and a lot of daubing, the tip is worn out. And so that little spongy thing is 50 cents. And you get a new tip and you refill it and you clean it all up. And it comes with multiple tips when you buy it and a little tool. And we've got order forms if you're interested. Anyway, I want you to know that the order forms are there. And I want you to just make sure that there's information over there because this makes life wonderful. You can put the cap in your pocket and you can lay this down on the ground and it's not going to drip. The only time it's going to drip if you misuse it. If you are scraping the tip across the wood and wearing it out, then it's going to drip. You have to be daubing up and down like this, okay? And you have to go around the stump like 3 times because you want to watch that soak in. So that's one of those 4 or 5 reasons ways you can do it wrong. If you just whip around really quick and then take off, no, you just got to watch it. This is almost nothing that's going in there. Your 1-inch fresh cut stump, you're going to go around the perimeter a few times and just watch it soak in. If it's a little bitty guy, you just treat the whole thing, okay? But if it's bigger, look at that. That's my glove, my hand. It's March, and it's 35 degrees outside. You can be cutting buckthorn and stump treating. Isn't that something? So this made life just beautiful, really beautiful. So this company sells, just doing it not for money, just so people could get rid of their buckthorn. They sell a little blue dye that you can order. They sell little identification books on how you can identify native plants with your buck. Anyway, it's called Landscape Restoration. Landscape Restoration. Landscape-restoration.com. All right. Next. Here we go. Okay, so when I was giving buckthorn workshops 18 years ago and I had slides, this was what not to do. This was a picture of buckthorn that was cut in the winter and they lost the stump and the snow was this deep, okay? But guess what? It's really the right thing to do because they left a tall stump. You can come back and make that final cut. So if you want to get rid of a female that's producing berries, you just want to get rid of it and you cut it and leave that tall stump and you don't even have time to treat the stump right now, it's going to be a while before it produces berries again. So there's a lot of places that we have in Minnetonka parks where we haven't made it back to treat yet and it's regrown, but you still quit the fruit production and you can make that final cut later. Does that make sense? I hope that is like, wow, saves you a lot of work and you don't have to do it all immediately. Do it when you want. Okay, good. All right. So now, these back to my college days. The top 2 priorities. You have to memorize this. The top 2 priorities that keep you from having to do just gobs of work when it's miserable in the summer and it's hot and sticky. You don't want to be doing it. You can do it in the off season from November all the way to the end of March. You can be working on your garlic, your buckthorn. So I put these little ribbons around with the dots on it because that's a female. That signifies berries. And the top priorities, 2 equally important top priorities is to kill the females first because you don't want them to keep producing any more fruit. And then you got to find the native plants and you got to label them somehow. And then you got to clear around those and protect them. Okay? So here, this is a really extreme example. There is wild rose, red stems of wild rose growing right in between this clump here. And they got flagged and they got cut down. And a couple of years later, they just grew like crazy. They got sunlight and they produced a whole bunch of new stems coming up from the ground. And they flowered and they fruited. And the bonus came up in the fall. So here's the fruiting. This is wild rose hip came. And then there were roots in the soil. So I'm talking about you who have unbulldozed areas. There's roots in the soil from a long time ago. You might get some things coming back that are kind of interesting. Yes, sir. Oh, 6+ years. The question is, how long do those seeds that are dropping all the time last? 6 or more years, and there is a seed bank in the soil. And so the 15 years that I've been working here, we've been cutting and cutting and cutting, and it's been growing back and growing back and growing back. Wow. That's a lot of work. So this is not for the lighthearted at all. I mean, there's a lot, but there are things that you can do with all those that germinate. We might have to talk about it after a little bit, but I'll talk a little bit about what to do. But there are some good things that are in there. Seed bank is there a long time. This is another really old photograph where this stump has been treated, but I don't have the blue dye in it. This is now to talk to you about slopes. And it's a little bit more work to cut up the wood, but if you live on a slope, if the buckthorn is growing on a slope and you're cutting, it's really good to keep some on the slope with soil contact. Keywords, soil contact. This log here, this buckthorn log, got delimbed and is laying flat on the ground. You know, if there's holes under other brush under here, the water is just going to run right under it. But what you want to do is slow down the water flow. With these heavy rainstorms that we've been having these last number of years, we all know we're having increased rainfall and we're having increased intensity. Just a week ago, we had intense rain. Anyway, lots and lots of erosion is happening. We don't want to we want to reduce the erosion. So if you slash on the ground with full soil contact, this is labor intensive, you can slow down the water flow. And when you're slowing down the water flow, you increase infiltration, which is good for the trees, which we had a terrible drought last summer. It was hot, baking hot and dry. And if every drop that comes down actually goes into the soil rather than running off, that's a very good thing. So I'm a proponent of keeping some slash on site neatly. I've got some pictures of things that are neat and some things that are not so neat. But slash also reduces soil temperature as habitat. It's on the low end of the food web, so that there's spiders and amphibians and some reptiles that can live in the slash on the ground, and then they're eaten by the hawks and the owls, and so the food web is functioning if you don't scrape it clean. All right, so here's Lake Rose. Some volunteers, and we wanted to keep some logs on site, and we did. We're trying to imitate nature. I mean, there's nature. It's a dead tree laying on the ground. On the uphill side, it's trapped leaves and silt, and it's actually built up. It's a wonderful place for plants to grow. On the downhill side, it has eroded, just what nature does. So you do the same thing. This is messy. We didn't get it very neat, but here it's trapped the leaves, it's trapped the silt, and it's eroding on the downhill side. And you can see where soil is lost. I mean, when we have those heavy rainstorms, you can actually see half an inch of soil lost in one rain episode. So here's a deer trail that was at Lake Rose, and so we just put the logs on the downhill side of the deer trail, so the people walk on the deer paths as well. You know, try and keep it neat. It can be messy sometimes. I mean, it doesn't have to be. You can make it neater, but it's really functioning. It's functioning in the ecosystem. And here's where it's messy, but things grew through it. More examples. Really, really steep slope at Lake Rose. Very, very steep for recycling. Now, there's another method of removing buckthorn. Has anybody heard of the weed wrench? The weed wrench. Yep. Okay. It is a fun tool to use. It's a big lever. You put the lever around the stem. You put this lever around the stem of buckthorn, and then you lean it over, and it just cranks the roots right out. Very fun and satisfying to use. But I don't use it on any of my projects. I'll tell you why. We were working on a project. I was volunteering actually for a city, and it was in November when the natives all went dormant, so we weren't trampling on any wildflowers in a really nice big woods, sugar maple basswood forest, and we're using weed wrenches and cranking them out. And everybody was tossing the buckthorn up onto this big pile. And it's the devil's in the details. You should be shaking all the soil off right into that hole and tamping the soil back in. But guess what? When those trees were coming out and being thrown up onto a big pile, they were full of globs of soil, and there were sedges and wildflowers coming out with them. And up to this pile that was going to be disposed of somehow, but those were all dead. I mean, when those roots dry out, those plants are dead, all the sedges and the wildflowers that were there. And then you've got big holes all over the place, and if it's on a slope, you have a rainstorm and you're washing the soil down the hill. So you want those roots to be, especially if you're on a slope, you want the roots to be holding the soil in place. So if you're cutting and you're daubing around a 1-inch stump with just this minuscule amount of herbicide that's going in there, which decomposes really fast, doesn't go anywhere in the soil, biodegrades fast, and you've got all those roots still holding the soil in place. Wouldn't you want to do that rather than rip them out by the roots? The roots, it's a lot of work to crank them out and then shake off all that soil and tamp it all back in place. So that is, the cut stump treatment is the best way to go. Now, there's some people that absolutely do not want to use herbicides, and so if you are on flat ground and not on a hillside, you can do that if you're willing to do all the labor of shaking all that soil back in and making sure that the sedges get replanted and the wildflowers. Now, if it's the middle of the summer and it's dry and the leaves dry out for just a second and don't get watered in, those plants are dead, you know, the ones that come out. So I'm not in favor of this stuff. It says Janet, but it's got a lot of cobwebs in my garage. I think I gave it away. Anyway, this picture is after all the soil got shaken off and shaken and shaken and shaken. So I should have taken a picture with all the huge soil blob. So I don't recommend it. It has its place if you're going to really do a lot of work. Okay. So now when you're hand pulling, when the soil is moist and you've got the little guys, hand pulling really works. Same thing. If you're on a slope, you've got to shake off all that soil right back in and tamp it all back in place. This is amazing. This happens with kids all the time. They got that blob of soil and they got a tree and they're just going to whack the soil on the tree and dump all of the soil on the ground. Beautiful earth, beautiful organic soil, but why would you not want to do that? If you have garlic mustard in that woods and find that plant that comes up in flowers and sprinkle seed right down on top of that exposed soil, you've got a brand new garlic mustard patch. Garlic mustard spreads like crazy. You want to be tamping the soil back in place and replacing the leaf litter. So these are the plants that you could lose if you rip them up with a weed wrench and if you, aren't paying attention even when they're dormant. And these are the things that could be coming back for you when you cut your buckthorn down. So don't be too discouraged. I've had buckthorn for 25 years on your property and it's old growth. You are going to have native plants come back, but you're going to have a lot of nasty stuff too. But the way you save these beautiful native wildflowers, I mean, people have violets all over in their grass, but they're wonderful for a ground cover in the woods. And we've got rue anemone, Pennsylvania sedge. There are some volunteers that come and start pulling that out. And wait, why are you doing that? Well, I pull grass out of my garden all the time. It's not turf grass that's spread. It's a native plant. Sedge belongs in the woods. Just letting you know that there's some really cool native stuff out there. Jack in the pulpit is one of the last plants to disappear in a buckthorn-infested woods, and one of the first plants to come back. It's a bulb. It's a bulb under the ground, and it disappears when it gets too shady. And when you cut your buckthorn back, you might have Jack in the pulpit come back right away. Really fun to propagate this plant. Talk about that later. We got more stuff. All right, so protection of ground cover species is cutting when the ground is frozen. So we're having a big, huge project at Cullen Preserve right now, and the big machines are in there cutting. They had to have 6 inches of ground frost in the ground before those machines were allowed in there, and we don't let the machines in there at all in our woodlands in summer. Forget it. So that's how you keep the roots of your native plants in good shape. So here we are, back to restoration. You cut out a gob of buckthorn, and the next year, so here we have, this is the plethora of seedlings all over the ground. There's a super buckthorn-infested area. And then all of a sudden, this thing shot up, taller than everything else. That is the sprout of an aspen tree. Aspen trees sprout from their root system. I bet there's somebody in here that knows that aspens are clones, and they sprout and form a whole grove of trees together. They're all combined in one root system. You cut down some trees in a really densely shaded area. If there's an aspen tree nearby, those roots are going to sense the extra sunlight that's on the ground, and they're going to send up suckers, which are new young trees. And there is an easily restored plant. I mean, you've got a brand new tree. It's a pioneer species. Anecdote is that some of the root systems of aspen trees are thousands of years old. The tops die down, and the roots keep sprouting up, and the tops die. And they use them for oriented strand board and particle board, harvested in northern Minnesota. And those roots have been there for thousands of years, growing up, cut down. Anyway, so that would be a plant I would put a spiral tube on. I'd protect it because the deer love brand new aspen when they come up, so they get browsed like crazy. So that'd be something I would protect. And that's coming up, tree protection. Here we go. Oh, here we're back to the seeds. So when I showed you the picture of the jack in the pulpit, you can collect the seeds. These are the two most common wildflowers until the deer love this. This is fall Solomon seal, and it has a cluster of creamy colored flowers in the spring and May, and then they have red berries in the fall. Now jack in the pulpit has a cluster of shiny red berries in the fall, and the leaves are all breaking down. If you collect these seeds and just squish them in your fingers, and you've got the pulp, and just put them into the soil, fingertip, just right under the soil surface, you squish off that pulp. The pulp is a germination inhibitor. So it's got to naturally decompose before that seed's going to germinate. So if you squish them in your fingers and poke them in the ground, you already saved a year, and you get germination faster. So I like to, when I put cages around plants to protect them, because there's so much garlic mustard and so much junk coming up, I'll put the seeds inside the cages so I can kind of keep an eye, because when those baby seedlings come up, they're just teeny tiny little things. But 3 years later, you've got a nice plant that might be blooming for you that you forgot to even seed it in there in the first place. Oh, so I missed that whole thing. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, we're talking about, so when you've got a plethora of seedlings covering the ground like this, you can do a spray. That's the one time I'm not using the daubers, because there's just way too much. You can do a spray in the fall, but you wait until about October 15th, you're just watching the fall colors, and when the native plants have pretty much dropped their leaves, the buckthorn remains green, and you can go in there and you can spray. But you do need to spray a little bit higher concentration. The typical foliar spray for foliar plants is usually about 3%, and we usually need about 6% to spray buckthorn seedlings in the fall. Now, there's another process that I will tell you about after we're done filming, about if you've got a lot of young buckthorn just all over the place and they're all this big or this big. I'll tell you about another process, but it's just going to get the program too long. I will tell you about that later if you like. It's called the critical period cut, followed by the buckthorn over. Really cool method. All right. I thank you very much for asking. All right. If you do have an area that's totally bulldozed and you don't have your natural soil that's been there forever, you're going to have to replant. This is that big willow next to the parking lot, and it's been bulldozed to make the parking lot. So we just used logs that were laying in the woods to make these little terraces and planted wildflowers in there, and now we've full slope wildflowers. Lots of different things you can do. There's some really easy covers of Minnesota native plants that, see here. These are all from my garden, and not my garden, my yard. I decided I wanted to do native landscaping many years ago, and the ants over the place. And some of these are kind of aggressive wildflowers. And believe it or not, I offer to people they can come over every spring and every fall and dig in my yard if you want to, because I need a place to walk. And so I offer this to people. So wild ginger is very easy to propagate. Wild columbine, I don't have very much of that, but I've got a lot of ostrich fern. Ostrich fern spreads by underground rhizomes. You don't want it in your formal garden, but in your woodland it would be just fine. Wild ginger can be divided and divided and divided, and it's a wonderful plant. Virginia waterleaf, again, prolific cedar. But you know what? The deer love it. So these are aggressive native plants, but do you find them out in the woods? You don't. We don't have very much left anymore because the ecology is out of balance. And so the more invasive species there are, the more the deer eat the native plants and make them disappear. You can have way more wildflowers on your property than there would be in the woods, if that makes sense. Kind of out of balance. All right, here we go. So easy to grow native woodland species. I'm not going to talk about that right now. I have a handout that covers that. If you want to get that, that's an optional handout tonight. So now we've got the rodents. Here we talked about the evolution of all these organisms together, and the native animals eat the native plants. And this is when the snow is dropping, just like right now in March. The wet temperatures are starting to go up. The animals are becoming more active, and they're looking for food, and the ground is frozen. And what do they eat? The cambium of the woody tissue. And so when the snow is dropping, the rabbits are going out every night, and as it's going down, they're eating. And here we have all of our favorite native species that I put on your list that you should be planting to get after you take your buckthorn out. So here we have arrowwood, wow, chokecherry, hazel, gray dogwood, all of our native plants get eaten. We need to protect them. So when we're doing our top 2 priorities, taking out the females with the berries and clearing around the natives, you find the native species, you put the ribbon flag on it, you clear the buckthorn around it, then you've got to protect the native. So here's the protection. In my yard, when they're seedlings and young, I'll use this is called hardware cloth. Isn't that a strange name? Hardware cloth. You can buy it in a 25-foot roll at the hardware store, and that's nice for seedlings. You can make a hoop over the top when it's growing. This is a goat dogwood coming out of it. I'll usually use white wire flags in my yard. If something that needs to get protected, I'll put a white wire flag in there, or a white wire flag where there's some wildflowers that I want to pull garlic mustard around and make sure I don't have wildflowers. Now what? Okay. It worked. Okay, then the deer. So you protect the bottom part of the plant from the rodents, and then the deer come and eat from the top, and they also rub their antlers. So that's a big problem, and the deer populations are pretty out of control. Up north, the deer typically will have 1 fawn per year, but they're doing so well in the urban areas, eating everybody's hostas, that they're having twins and triplets. Really, they explode. They explode, and it's just totally out of balance. So we're missing a lot of wildflowers in our native woodlands because of the deer, which is really sad. All right. Anyway, so they also rub their antlers when the males are in the. They love any wood post that's 1 inch to 2 inches in diameter, and you can plant a $300 ball and burlap tree and have the deer come in and destroy it. I mean, and when there's this open, think of this like an open skin wound. I mean, it's not bleeding, but decay fungi have spores floating around all over in the air that you cannot see. And they land on that. It does not have bark. Decay starts to grow to the interior of it. And so the tree is going to try and close over that wound over many, many years. It will grow over. But in the meantime, it could be decaying and cracking over. I mean, it's really serious damage to valuable trees. So these are spiral tree guards. Oh, no. Woody. This is spiral tree guards. Those are very good, but the danger is you have to loosen them. They could strangle the tree, so you've got to loosen them every once in a while. I keep them on there for a pretty good long time. They also will have, ants and stuff. So it's good to take them off in the summertime and then put them back on by August, for sure. Protect from the rodents. You also want to have them inside the cages. Okay, so these are all the materials I use on my property, depending on what size the plant is. So if it's young, I'm using these, whatever's cheap and easy for me. These are for the young stuff, the young things. And if you've got full sun, you can use 2x tree shelters, but then you've got to protect them when they come out the top. They'll grow real fast in these little greenhouse-like structures. This is called welded wire fencing. This is the best for deer. You'll notice that it's been extended to go higher because the deer can come and eat right over the top. It's okay if they do eat some browsing around the outside, as long as you've got the leader up and out, okay? Protecting that leader and letting it go up and out. You don't have to have the whole, but you got to protect the plant. Alrighty. And sometimes you can put a fence around a whole entire area. And that's what we're starting to do in the park. Just put, 10 by 10 fences for areas where we want to preserve the wildflowers. And they're hard to see. They're hard. They're pretty camouflaged. Anyway, and then there's brush pile deterrents. I mean, the deer are kind of lazy. They've got it really good in the suburbs. They don't like walk around an area. You could have little seedlings growing up in this little brush pile to buy you some time, or you put some protection around them. Anyway, some examples. And then there's wood waste utilization. I mean, buckthorn wood is beautiful. You can make things out of it if you've got time. I've already mentioned before that you can chip right back into the woods. If you're chipping back in the woods, try not to put any of the berries and chip them back in the woods. So those would go into your burn pile or somewhere else. Erosion control, you can recycle. You can put You can blow them. If you're cutting in the wintertime and chipping them back into the woods, is really nice because you've got this nice ground cover that's going to make sure that they don't go any deeper than about 2 inches, because then the wildflowers can come up through them. The brand new seedlings, the nice thing is that the brand new seedlings of buckthorn and garlic mustard aren't going to penetrate 2 inches of mulch, but the plants that are already existing can penetrate. Does that make sense? Can penetrate. So we also, it's very good firewood. It's good for woodworking. We have the Minnetonka brush jar I told you about already. And just for the heck of it, one fall we had a buckthorn woodworking workshop and had people bring in the things that they have made. And it's amazing. You can make something just out of the wood itself, make a little arbor. Actually turn them on a lathe and make all kinds of different products. Beautiful, beautiful wood. Just FYI. So now we are finally at the end, and we're going to review the top priorities for buckthorn. This is great. So now you do not have to feel like you have to clear your whole woods all at one time. You can do it in little pieces. You know what the priorities are. Ribbon flag the native species before cutting starts. So keep them flagged because the buckthorn grows way faster than the native plants do. And so if you cut and miss a stump of a buckthorn and you've got a native plant flagged right next to it, the buckthorn can grow 5 feet in 1 year on an untreated stump. So you're going to want that flag there for them coming back and doing more work. Okay? You want to remove or kill the females first. I've already talked about that. Releasing the natives. This is getting redundant. Protect the special natives with the tree guards. We're just reviewing. That was all just recent. What else? Don't remove all the buckthorn if garlic mustard is present. Keep some of it there, the males, and watch how your woods responds to increased sunlight. So the buckthorn will get bigger and produce more fruit the more sunlight it has. Excuse me. The garlic mustard will be a bigger plant and produce more seeds. So you've got to get on it. So got to be, if you're starting this buckthorn cutting, it's a long-term commitment. You've got to be watching for the invasive species during the growing season every year. And the goal is to not let the invasive species drop seed. So if you can get them out, you can cut off the seed tops, put them in the bag, and then put the rest in the compost if you want to. Or you can let them lay there in the woods with the roots exposed to dry out. We'll talk about that in detail at the garlic mustard workshop that's coming up in May. Don't cut all the vines. You know which vines are good and which ones aren't, so keep the woodbine. You can, there's a fantastic website. If you've got a pen and a piece of paper to write down, there is a fantastic website where any plant that you're going to find on your woodlot, on your property, that could come up, or something in our parks, is at minnesotawildflowers.info. There are some botanists that have devoted a decade of their life to making sure that they have records, really good records of native plants. And it's all online and it's all free. And it's not just one photograph. If you click on one picture on a species, one picture, there's a little box, you pick on one picture, you're going to have 10 pictures that you can scroll through of that plant in all different stages. It's an amazingly wonderful website. And it started out wildflowers, but then they started going after everything that grows in Minnesota. And the only thing that they don't have are just some of the rarest species that they can't find. So it's a fantastic website. And they've also got invasive species. They went into aquatics. And it is minnesotawildflowers.info. And I just tell you how wonderful it is. These things weren't around when I was in college trying to learn plants. Anyway, so back to this. So I'm saying, why did I bring that up? If you can't tell the difference between the vines, you can look up the vines on the website, find the difference between woodbine and wild grape. Which one do you want to kill? Which reuse your wood? We already talked about that. Tap into grant money and local green volunteers. You know, the watershed district has free money out there. If you live near a creek or a pond or a lake and you've got a slope and you tell them you want to do restoration and prevent erosion and silt going into the wetland, you can get grant money. So look up 9 Mile Creek Watershed District. Look up Minnetonka Creek Watershed District. There might be some money out there for you. And there are a lot of residents that have have gotten into that. So do something every year, no matter how small. I mean, really, if you're bored, you can go out and kill a female buckthorn pretty easily. You can do something every year. And these are the keys to success, because if you start this as a long-term process, so prioritize your work. You already know what your priorities are now. Do ecologically sound methods. Have a positive attitude and a long-term commitment. And when you are done, something surprising might with the weeds that come up. You know, your garlic mustard there are going to be some surprises. You see all the buckthorn seedlings in there? Some good things come up too. So we can, if you want to keep filming, you surely can, because there might be some questions that are beneficial to others, and you can decide whether they want to edit it out or not. But thank you. You just sat here for 1 hour and 50 minutes, and you could have watched a full-length movie, and you watched buckthorn. So I congratulate all of you. I really do congratulate all of you, because you know how to do it the right way now, and you know how to ask if you want to get somebody to do the work for you, you know how to ask the right questions. But I'm open to questions. Oh, wonderful question. That's on your yellow handout on the back side. And no, you have to be if you're within 10 feet of open water, you can use glyphosate. But they have an aquatic version of glyphosate called Aquaneat that you can buy and use in wetland areas. And so you just look for that, Naval. Good question. Yes, sir. Thank you for sitting here. My gosh, it's a long time to sit and learn about buckthorn. Thank you for coming.